It was supposed to be a simple meeting, just another step toward her dream. But the moment she walked into that bank, everything changed. The cool blast of air conditioning hit her skin as she entered the towering glass doors of Crest Hill Bank, a historic institution in downtown Atlanta. The floors gleamed beneath the soft hum of quiet conversations and the tapping of keyboards. Wealth lived here, etched into the mahogany desks, reflected in the marble countertops, hanging from the gold-trimmed chandeliers. It was designed to remind people like her who had power and who didn't. Felicia Robinson adjusted the sleeve of her navy blue blazer, smoothing it down as she approached the front desk. She carried herself with quiet confidence, poised, polished, and completely in control. Her deep brown skin glowed under the bank's fluorescent lights, and her dark almond-shaped eyes held a sharpness that came from years of hard work. A sleek bob framed her face, every strand perfectly in place, complementing the gold studs in her ears. The receptionist, a young woman with tight blonde curls and a forced smile, barely looked up. "I have a 10 a.m. appointment with James Whitmore," Felicia said, her voice calm but firm. The receptionist's gaze flicked up, scanning her from head to toe, taking in the confidence in Felicia's stance, the poise in her expression. Something unreadable flashed across her face before she gestured toward the waiting area. "Have a seat. He'll be with you shortly." Felicia nodded, but she didn't sit. She stood, letting her presence settle into the space. She wasn't a woman used to waiting, and she wasn't about to start now. A few minutes later, a tall, middle-aged man in a crisp gray suit emerged from the office corridor. His hair was neatly parted, his gold watch gleaming under the recessed lighting. James Whitmore. His eyes swept the room before landing on Felicia. Something in his face twitched. Surprise? Annoyance? But he quickly masked it, painting on a professional, detached smile. "Miss Robinson, come on back." She followed him through the maze of polished desks and private offices, her heels clicking against the floor. The scent of expensive coffee and leather filled the air. This wasn't just a bank. It was an ecosystem of power and privilege, built to serve people who already had both. James motioned for her to take a seat in his office, a sleek space with a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind his desk, a row of plaques and framed degrees hung in neat alignment. Felicia didn't waste time. She pulled out her portfolio, thick with financial statements, business projections, and growth strategies. "I'm here for a business loan. I run Robinson Originals. A boutique marketing firm in Midtown. We've been operating for 7 years with steady revenue growth. I'm looking to expand." James took the folder from her hands but didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced. "Tell me about your business." Felicia exhaled slowly. "I specialize in digital branding. We work with both corporate and independent clients, managing brand identities, campaigns, and marketing strategies. Last year, we generated just over $2.5 million in revenue. We're on track to increase that by 30% this year." She paused, waiting for a reaction. Nothing. James nodded as if he were only half listening, flipping open the file with an uninterested glance. His eyes skimmed the documents with the air of a man going through the motions, not someone evaluating a real opportunity. "And you're looking for how much?" $500,000, Felicia said evenly. She had done the math. It wasn't a risk. It was an investment. James let out a small breath, setting the folder down as if it were suddenly heavier. "That's quite a number." Felicia met his gaze without blinking. "It's standard for the level of expansion I'm planning." James offered a tight smile, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Look, Miss Robinson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but these things take time. We typically prefer to work with businesses that have a more, how should I put it, established track record. Felicia's expression didn't waver. I have 7 years in the industry. James smiled politely, but it didn't reach his eyes. I understand that, but we also have certain lending criteria to consider. Felicia felt the shift immediately. The conversation was no longer about her qualifications. It never had been. Her credit score was near perfect. Her business revenue spoke for itself. Her financials were rock solid. But James wasn't looking at her numbers. He was looking at her. She had seen this before. The silent rejection wrapped in professionalism, the thinly veiled doubt, the unspoken message that she didn't belong in rooms like this. She didn't react. Not yet. What criteria are we talking about exactly? James hesitated, flipping through her documents as if searching for something, anything, to justify what he was about to say. Your cash flow is good, but we typically prefer applicants with additional collateral, maybe a co-signer. Do you have anyone who could back the loan? Felicia clenched her jaw, keeping her rage buried beneath composure. A co-signer? For a business that was already profitable? I own commercial property, she said. That's listed in my financials. James nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against his desk. Yes, but we still have to be mindful of risk. Felicia exhaled, forcing a polite smile. So, let me get this straight. You're denying my loan because my business, which generates millions annually, isn't stable enough for you? But if I were to bring in another person who isn't part of my business, that would change your mind. James hesitated, then leaned back with a carefully measured expression. I'm saying these things take time. Perhaps you could try a community loan or a smaller bank that specializes in businesses like yours. There it was. Businesses like yours. A cold, familiar anger spread through Felicia's chest. She had worked too hard, built too much, beaten too many odds to sit here and be told to try something smaller, as if her ambitions had limits. She took a slow breath, steadied herself, and then smiled. Not the kind of smile James was expecting. Not one of acceptance or gratitude. A different kind of smile. One that said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Felicia reached for her folder, tucking it neatly back into her bag. She rose from her chair and smoothed her blazer, glancing at the view behind him, her city, her future. Then she looked him dead in the eye. Thank you for your time. She turned and walked out, but not before letting her gaze sweep the bank once more. The desks, the tellers, the loan officers who thought they were the gatekeepers of success. She had one final thought before the doors shut behind her. They don't know it yet, but they work for me. The shift was coming, quiet, inevitable, and far more devastating than they could have imagined. What James didn't know, what no one in that bank realized, was that Felicia wasn't just another businesswoman asking for a loan. She was their landlord, and now it was time for them to find out. The city lights flickered against Felicia's office window as she leaned back in her chair, her mind razor-sharp with focus. Robinson Originals had been her pride and joy for years, but it wasn't the only thing she owned. Her grandfather, Earl Robinson, had been a visionary, a man who worked 3 jobs, saved every penny, and believed in one thing above all else: ownership. Land is power, Felicia, he used to tell her when she was little, sitting on his lap as he flipped through property deeds. They can't push you out if you own the ground they stand on. And he had done just that. Bought buildings when no one believed a black man could, in an era when doors were slammed in his face. When he passed, he left those buildings to her, including the very office space where James Whitmore had just humiliated her. The irony made her want to laugh, but she wasn't laughing yet. She reached for her phone and dialed. David? It's time. On the other end, David Ortiz, Her real estate attorney and longtime friend let out a small chuckle. He knew exactly what that meant. "Thought you'd say that," he said, flipping through paperwork on his desk. "Crest Hill's lease renewal is up in 60 days. Want me to send them the new terms?" Felicia's lips curled into a slow smile. "No rush. Let's do this in person." David whistled. "Oh, you're gonna enjoy this." She already was. 1 week later, back at Crest Hill Bank. The receptionist barely had time to react before Felicia walked past her desk, heels clicking against the polished marble floors. Unlike last time, she wasn't here to wait. She was here to remind them who owned the building they worked in. Inside the glass-walled conference room, James Whitmore sat stiffly in his chair, his hands folded neatly over a legal pad. His face paled slightly when he saw Felicia walk in, but he quickly recovered, forcing a polite smile. Beside him sat Thomas Caldwell, the bank's regional manager, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for being ruthless in negotiations. He didn't know what was coming. Felicia took her seat across from them, calm and poised. David sat beside her, placing a thick folder on the table with deliberate slowness. Thomas cleared his throat, glancing between Felicia and James. "Miss Robinson, I understand you wanted to discuss a business matter?" Felicia nodded, then slid the folder toward him. "Yes, it concerns your lease renewal." Thomas frowned, flipping open the document. James, seated beside him, leaned in slightly, a shadow of confusion flickering across his face. Felicia continued, her voice smooth. "As you know, Crest Hill Bank has been a tenant in this building for the past 12 years. Your lease is set to expire in 60 days. Thomas skimmed the contract, his expression neutral, until his eyes landed on a section marked Updated Lease Terms. His brow furrowed. What is this?" Felicia folded her hands on the table, her expression unreadable. "An update to your agreement. Effective immediately, your monthly rent will increase by 40%. James nearly choked. "Excuse me?" Felicia turned to him, tilting her head slightly. "Is something unclear?" Thomas's mouth pressed into a thin line. "A 40% increase? That's absurd." David cleared his throat, flipping to another page. "It's actually quite reasonable, considering market rates. This building has been undervalued for years. We're simply bringing it in line with current commercial property values." James's face darkened. "You can't just decide to raise the rent like that." Felicia raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I can." The room fell silent. For the first time, James truly looked at Felicia, not as a woman seeking a loan, not as someone beneath him, but as someone with power. She let the silence stretch before speaking again, slow and deliberate. "You see, James, last week, when I came in here, I was asking for a loan. But what you didn't know was that I already had everything I needed. This bank has been leasing this space from me for years. And yet, you sat there, looking me in the eye, telling me I wasn't qualified for a simple business loan." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Miss Robinson, that was simply a financial decision. It had nothing to do with—" "Oh, spare me," she cut him off, her tone sharp but controlled. "We both know what it was about." Thomas let out a slow breath, trying to regain control. "Miss Robinson, these lease terms are excessive. This increase puts us in a difficult position." Felicia leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "That's unfortunate." She let the words settle before adding, "I assume you're familiar with the vacancy rates in this part of the city? You won't find another location like this at a lower price. Moving would be inconvenient." Thomas's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. Relocating a fully operational branch would cost them millions. Customers, logistics, contracts. It would be a nightmare. James looked at Thomas as if expecting him to fight harder. Instead, The older man sighed, setting down the folder. He had been in this game long enough to know when he'd lost. "What are your final terms?" he asked. Felicia smiled, leaning forward. "A 40% increase, effective next quarter. And one more thing," she turned to James, watching as he stiffened under her gaze. "I no longer want to do business with Crest Hill Bank. After this lease expires, you'll vacate the premises." James's face turned red. "You can't be serious." Felicia's smile didn't waver. "Oh, I'm very serious." Silence. Heavy. Unmovable. Thomas exhaled through his nose. He had no choice. "Fine." Felicia stood, smoothing her blazer. "Pleasure doing business with you." She turned, walking toward the door, but then she paused. Glancing back at James, she added, just loud enough for him to hear, "Next time you tell a black woman she's not qualified, make sure she doesn't own the ground you're standing on." Then she walked out, her heels clicking against the marble, leaving James sitting there, speechless, and for the first time in his career, powerless. As Felicia stepped out into the cool Atlanta air, she pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hey, it's me. Get the press ready. I have a story they'll want to hear." This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been told no when they deserved a yes. And she was going to make sure the whole world knew it. The moment James saw the paperwork, his face turned pale. The balance of power had shifted, and there was nothing he could do about it. Felicia sat across from him, her expression unreadable, not cold, not smug, just calm. That was the worst part. The silence between them stretched, thick with an unspoken truth. James had no control here. Thomas Caldwell, the regional manager, sat beside him, flipping through the lease documents with a slow, deliberate pace. His weathered fingers paused over the numbers, the rent increase, the renewal conditions, the fine print that might as well have been a death sentence for their branch. James could feel the heat rising in his face. This wasn't happening. Just last week, this woman had been sitting across from him as an applicant, one he had dismissed without a second thought. Now, she held their future in her hands. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice measured. "Miss Robinson, these terms are aggressive." Felicia didn't blink. "They're fair." James shifted in his chair. "A 40% increase? That's outrageous." David Ortiz, Felicia's attorney, leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "Actually, it's a market adjustment. This building has been undervalued for years." Felicia finally spoke, her voice smooth. "And let's be honest, James. If I had walked in here asking for a loan to buy this building, you would have told me I was aiming too high. Yet here we are." James's throat felt dry. He glanced at Thomas, expecting him to push back harder, but the older man remained quiet. Thomas wasn't an idiot. He had been in this business long enough to know when he'd lost. Still, he made one last attempt. "Miss Robinson, you have to understand. This increase puts us in a difficult position." Felicia tilted her head slightly. "I understand perfectly, but that's business, isn't it?" The way she said it, calm, patient, like she was explaining something simple, made James's stomach twist. This was revenge. Felicia leaned back, studying him. "I see two options. You can renew the lease under these terms." She tapped a neatly manicured finger on the contract. "Or you can vacate the premises." James stiffened. "You wouldn't do that." She arched an eyebrow. "Wouldn't I?" Silence. James could feel the blood pounding in his ears. Moving the branch would be a logistical nightmare. Millions in relocation costs, lost customers, a damaged reputation. Corporate would never approve it. They had no choice. Thomas exhaled slowly. "If we agree to renew, are these terms final?" Felicia nodded, with one additional condition. James tensed. There it was. Felicia turned her gaze directly to him. Crest Hill Bank will commit to a full internal review of its lending practices, and I want that in writing. James's jaw clenched. So this was her endgame. Thomas sat up straighter. That's a separate issue. Felicia didn't flinch. No, it's not. David slid another document across the table. This outlines a formal commitment to equitable lending policies, ensuring fair access to business loans, particularly for minority-owned businesses. James stared at the paper, gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. Felicia watched him, waiting. Finally, Thomas reached for the pen. We'll sign. James's stomach dropped. The scratch of the pen against paper felt like the final nail in his coffin. When Thomas handed the signed agreement back to Felicia, she took her time looking it over. Satisfied, she slid it into her folder and stood. James felt a burning need to say something, anything, to claw back some dignity. This was personal, wasn't it? He muttered. Felicia turned back, meeting his gaze. It was necessary. She let the words settle before adding, If I'm not good enough for your loan, you're not good enough for my building. James swallowed hard. Felicia didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor. And for the first time in his career, James Whitmore was powerless. James Whitmore sat frozen in his chair, staring at the door Felicia Robinson had just walked through. The silence in the room was suffocating. Thomas Caldwell exhaled sharply and loosened his tie. Well, James, I hope you've learned something today. James's jaw clenched. This is a disaster. Thomas gave him a long, measured look. No, this is justice. He stood, tucking the signed documents into his briefcase. And if you weren't so blinded by your own biases, you would have seen this coming. James opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Because Thomas was right. Crest Hill Bank's loan denial had cost them everything. This isn't just one story. It's a reality for countless Black entrepreneurs fighting for the opportunities they deserve. But change starts with us. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share this video, start the conversation, and most importantly, support the businesses that are building a better future for us all.